April 15th, 1532. Smithfield Market, London. A man is chained inside a massive iron cauldron. Executioners light the fire beneath him. His screams pierce the morning air so horrific that pregnant women in the crowd collapse. One witness later wrote that the sound was unlike anything human. This is not medieval folklore. This is not exaggeration. This actually happened. And the king who made it law, Henry VIII. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. This execution method wasn't created for murderers or traitors. It was created for cooks, for servants, for anyone who might slip poison into your food. The victim's name was Richard Roos, and his crime, making soup. Henry didn't just want him dead. He wanted to send a message so terrifying that no one would ever dare threaten the king's dinner again. So he invented a law, the Act of Poisoning, 1531, that made boiling alive the official punishment. Before we dive into the most disturbing execution in Tudor history, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to see where this goes, because what happened next haunted England for decades. The afternoon light filters through narrow windows at Lambeth Marsh, just southwest of London. It's February 18th, 1531, and the air inside Bishop John Fisher's Episcopal residence carries the familiar smells of a Tudor kitchen. Wood smoke, herbs, boiling broths. 16 gentlemen gather around the bishop's table, their voices low in conversation. These are educated men, advisors, members of Fisher's inner circle. Outside the heavy wooden doors, another group waits in silence. The poor, widows, beggars, labourers. They come every day to the bishop's gates because Fisher is known for his charity. When his household finishes eating, the leftover food will be theirs. In the kitchen, a large pot bubbles over the fire. Pottage, thick porridge made from oats, grains, whatever vegetables the cook could find. This isn't lavish food. It's sustenance. Working class fare even at a bishop's table. But today, something else simmers in that pot. Something invisible. Something that will kill. The meal is served. Bowls filled with steaming pottage are placed before the gentlemen. They eat. They talk. They have no reason to suspect anything is wrong. But Bishop Fisher doesn't touch his portion. Not because he senses danger. He's fasting. Religious discipline. A choice that will save his life. Within an hour, the symptoms begin. One of the gentlemen, a man named Kerwin, clutches his stomach. His face goes pale. Then another feels it. A twisting, searing pain in the gut. Then another. The table erupts into chaos. Men double over, vomiting violently. Some can't stand. The pain is unlike anything they've felt before. This isn't food gone bad. This is something worse. Outside, the beggars have already taken the leftover pottage. Among them, a widow named Alice Tript. She's hungry. She eats quickly, and then she collapses. By evening, 2 people are dead. Kerwin and Alice Tript. The other 17 in total are fighting for their lives, writhing in agony, their bodies racked with convulsions. Physicians are summoned, but there's little they can do. Medieval medicine has no antidote for this. The victims can only wait, hoping the poison passes through their systems before it stops their hearts. The household erupts into panic. Servants are questioned. The kitchen is searched. How did this happen? Who did this? And why? Suspicion turns immediately to the staff. In Tudor England, poison is the invisible killer. It's the weapon of cowards, assassins, conspirators. It doesn't require strength or swordsmanship. It only requires access. And in Fisher's household, one man had that access. Richard Roos, the cook. Roos is arrested within hours. He's dragged to the Tower of London, where Thomas Cromwell himself oversees the interrogation. Cromwell is Henry VIII's chief enforcer, a man who understands power and fear. And Roos, terrified, begins to talk. Under torture, though the exact methods aren't recorded, Roos confesses. He admits to putting powder into a vessel of yeast standing in the bishop's kitchen. The yeast was used to make the pottage. Whatever substance he added, it contaminated the entire batch. But when pressed for why, Roos's story shifts. He claims it was a prank, a jest. He says he was given powders that were supposed to make people sick, not kill them. Just a laxative, he insists. Something to give the household an uncomfortable day. Nothing more. But no one believes him. The problem is motive. Why would a cook risk everything for a prank? And who gave him the powder? Roos won't say, or can't. Some contemporary accounts suggest he was bribed. Others hint at a larger conspiracy. Because Bishop Fisher wasn't just any bishop. He was one of King Henry VIII's most vocal opponents. Fisher had publicly defended Catherine of Aragon, Henry's wife, when the king sought to divorce her and marry Anne Boleyn. In 1529, at the legatine trial examining the validity of the royal marriage, Fisher had stood before the court and declared that it would be impossible to die more gloriously than in defense of marriage, just as John the Baptist had died. It was a direct challenge to the king, a refusal to bend. Henry never forgot. So when news of the poisoning reached the king, his reaction was swift and extreme. Henry had a morbid, obsessive fear of poison. In his mind, it was the ultimate betrayal, an attack that could come from anywhere, anyone, even a servant in your own kitchen. And now, one of England's most prominent religious figures, a man Henry despised, but could end openly attack, had nearly been murdered in exactly that way. The king didn't wait for a trial. He went directly to Parliament. On a cold March day in 1531, Henry VIII addressed the House of Lords. He spoke of the poisoning at Lambeth. He spoke of the dead. He spoke of the danger poison posed to every nobleman, every household, every king. And then he made his demand. Richard Roos would be condemned by act of attainder. No trial, no jury, no defense. Parliament would simply declare him guilty, and that would be the end of it. Attainder was typically used for criminals who had fled justice, men who couldn't be brought to court. But Roos was sitting in a prison cell. He was available for trial. Yet Henry wanted him declared guilty by decree, and Parliament, terrified of the king's wrath, obeyed. But Henry didn't stop there. He proposed a new law, the Act for Poisoning, 1531. It declared that willful murder by poison was now high treason, even if the victim wasn't the king. And the punishment? Not hanging, not beheading, not even the traditional traitor's death of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, boiling alive. The law passed swiftly. Historians would later note how unusual this was. Poisoning was rare in England. The act itself acknowledged this. Yet the royal response was immediate and brutal. Some scholars believe Henry used the case to send a message not just about poison, but about control, about what happened to those who threatened the people the king wanted threatened. Richard Roos's fate was sealed. The execution was scheduled for April, and London began to whisper about what was coming. An execution unlike anything England had seen in living memory. Nobody knows who Richard Roos really was. His name appears in documents spelled 4 different ways. Roos, Rouse, Cook, Rose. Some records call him a cook. Others say he was merely a friend of the cook, someone with access to the kitchen, but not officially part of the staff. History remembers him only for what happened in those final months. Everything before that moment in February 1531. Gone. Erased. As if he never existed. But we can imagine. Picture a man in his 30s, maybe younger. Hands weathered from years of working over hot fires, skin marked by burns from spattering oil and steam. He moves through the bishop's kitchen like he belongs there, knows where every pot hangs, where the herbs are stored, which barrels hold flour and which hold salt. The kitchen at Lambeth is his world. Servants come and go, but the kitchen remains. And in that kitchen, he has power. Not the kind of power nobles have, but something quieter, more intimate. He decides what goes into the food, what flavors, what ingredients. He's invisible to the men who eat at Fisher's table, but his work sustains them. Then something changes. We don't know what. The records don't say. But on the 18th of February, Richard Roos makes a choice that will end with him screaming in a cauldron at Smithfield. When the poisoning happens, chaos erupts. The gentlemen collapse. The widow dies at the gates. Physicians swarm the residence, helpless. And somewhere in that panic, Roos runs. He doesn't stay to protest his innocence. He doesn't claim it was an accident. He flees. The bishop's brother catches him before he makes it far. Roos is dragged back, bound, and sent to the Tower of London. The Tower, England's most feared fortress, where enemies of the crown disappear into stone cells and emerge broken, if they emerge at all. Thomas Cromwell oversees the interrogation. Cromwell, the king's right hand, a man who built his career on knowing when to threaten and when to strike. He understands that Roos is more than a cook. He's a symbol, and symbols matter. Under torture, Roos begins to talk, but his story is strange, inconsistent. He admits to putting something into the yeast barrel, the one used to make the pottage, but he insists it wasn't meant to kill. Just powders, he says. Something to make people sick. A prank. He claims someone gave them to him, told him they were harmless, just enough to give the household a rough day. Nothing more. But who gave him the powders? Roos won't say, or can't. Some historians believe he was bribed. Others think he was tricked, used as a pawn by someone with far darker intentions. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Bishop Fisher wasn't just any bishop. He was one of the few men in England willing to stand against King Henry VIII. Fisher had defended Catherine of Aragon when Henry wanted to cast her aside for an Boleyn. At the Legatine trial in 1529, Fisher stood before the court and declared he would rather die defending the sanctity of marriage than watch the king destroy it. He compared himself to John the Baptist, who was beheaded for speaking truth to power. It was a direct, unambiguous challenge. Henry never forgave him. So when news of the poisoning reached the king, whispers began to spread through London. What if Roos wasn't acting alone? What if someone powerful wanted Fisher dead and used a low-level servant to do the dirty work? What if the real target survived only by pure chance because Fisher happened to be fasting that day? And here's where the story gets darker. Some contemporary accounts suggest Henry himself might have orchestrated the poisoning, not to kill Fisher not yet, but to send a warning, to show what could happen, to remind Fisher that even in his own house, surrounded by his own staff, he was vulnerable. But the plan, if it was a plan, went wrong. The powder was supposed to make people sick, not kill them. 2 people died. And now the king had a problem. If Roos talked, if he named names, if he pointed a finger at anyone connected to the crown, it would destroy Henry's carefully constructed image as England's protector. So Roos had to be silenced, not just executed, but obliterated, made into an example so terrifying that no one would dare question what really happened. Henry went to Parliament, not quietly, not through intermediaries. He personally addressed the House of Lords on February 28, 1531. For an hour and a half, he spoke. Witnesses described it as a lengthy speech about justice, about the king's sacred duty to protect his subjects, about maintaining order in the realm. But beneath the rhetoric, there was rage, fear, control. He demanded that Richard Roos be condemned by act of attainder. No trial, no jury, no defense. Just a decree from Parliament declaring him guilty. This was unusual. Attainder was typically used for criminals who had fled the country, men who couldn't be brought to court. But Roos was sitting in a tower cell. He was available. He could have been tried before a judge, allowed to speak, to defend himself. But Henry didn't want that. Because a trial meant questions. A trial meant witnesses. A trial meant Roos might say something dangerous. So Parliament obeyed. Not the kind of fear that makes you cautious, the kind that makes you obsessive, the kind that keeps you awake at night, imagining invisible killers lurking in every cup of wine, every plate of meat, every slice of bread. By 1531, the king's paranoia had grown into something monstrous. He employed taste testers, servants whose sole job was to sample his food before it touched his lips. If the food was poisoned, they would die instead of him. They ate the best meals in England, knowing every bite could be their last. But it wasn't just food. Henry had staff members kiss every inch of his bedding before he climbed into bed each night. Every pillow, every blanket, every corner of the mattress, looking for poison residue, checking for danger that might not even exist. Guards stood watch while he slept, crossbows by his bed, daggers hidden under cushions. He lived like a man under siege in his own palace. And the worst part, he wasn't entirely wrong to be afraid. Poison had a dark reputation in Europe. Everyone knew the stories from Rome during the time of the Bojars. Pope Alexander VI Rodrigo Bojar himself had died in 1503, possibly from poison slipped into his food at a banquet. The substance was called cantarella, believed to be arsenic trioxide, and it was the weapon of choice for assassins who wanted their victims to die slowly, agonizingly, without leaving a trace. It was said that the Bojars had perfected the art of poisoning, turning murder into a science. Henry knew these stories. He obsessed over them. And when news reached him that someone had poisoned Bishop Fisher's household, killing 2 people, merely killing more, it confirmed his worst fears. Poison wasn't just a foreign threat anymore. It was here, in England, in London, in the kitchen of one of the most powerful religious figures in the kingdom. And Henry couldn't let that stand. But there was something else driving the king's reaction. Something darker. Bishop Fisher wasn't just any victim. He was Henry's enemy. A man who had publicly humiliated the king by defending Catherine of Aragon, by refusing to support the divorce, by standing in the way of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Fisher had compared himself to John the Baptist, a martyr willing to die for truth. It was a direct challenge, a refusal to submit. Henry hated him. So when the poisoning happened, the king saw an opportunity. He could use this tragedy to expand his power, to redefine the laws of England, to turn poison into something so terrifying that no one would ever dare attempt it again. And he could do it all in the name of justice. On February 28, 1531, just the days after the poisoning, let me personally address the household. This was unusual. Kings typically sent representatives to Parliament, men who spoke on their behalf, but Henry wanted to be there himself. He wanted them to see his fury, his conviction, his control. Witnesses say he spoke for an hour and a half. His voice echoed through the chamber, filled with righteous anger. He talked about the sanctity of trust, about how a man should be safe in his own home, about the duty of the crown to protect its subjects from invisible killers. He painted a picture of a kingdom under threat, where poison could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. And then he made his demand. Richard Roos would be condemned by act of attainder. No trial, no jury, no defense. Parliament would simply declare him guilty, and that would be the end of it. This shocked some of the lords. Attainder was a legal tool, yes, but it was meant for criminals who had fled the country, men who couldn't be brought to justice through normal means. Richard Roos was sitting in the Tower of London. He was available. He could have been tried before a judge, allowed to speak, to explain himself. But Henry didn't want that. Because a trial meant questions. A trial meant witnesses. A trial meant Roos might say something dangerous. So Parliament obeyed. The Act for Poisoning passed on March 2nd, 1531. And it didn't just condemn Richard Roos. It changed English law forever. The Act declared that willful murder by poison was now high treason, even if the victim was the king or a member of the royal family. This was extraordinary. Treason was supposed to be a crime against the crown, against the state. But now, poisoning anyone, even a commoner, was treason. And the punishment, boiling alive. The Act specified that offenders would be boiled to death in water, or lead, without having the advantage of clergy. That final phrase was crucial. Without the advantage of clergy meant no priest could hear the condemned's final confession. No last rites. No spiritual comfort before death. The condemned would die alone, in agony, with no hope of salvation. It was a punishment designed not just to kill, but to destroy the soul. Historians have argued for centuries about why Henry did this. Some say he was genuinely terrified of poison and wanted to create the most brutal deterrent possible. Others believe he was using the case to expand his own power, to reclassify more crimes as treason, so he could execute enemies without the inconvenience of common law. A few even suggest that Henry himself might have been involved in the original poisoning, that it was a botched attempt to warn Fisher, to show him how vulnerable he was, and that when 2 people died, Henry needed to cover his tracks by making Roos the scapegoat. We'll never know the truth, but what we do know is that the law was passed with frightening speed. From the day of the poisoning to the passage of the Act was less than 2 weeks. That's almost unheard of in the slow machinery of Parliament. It suggests that Henry had enormous influence, enormous control, and enormous fear. And now, all of England would see what happened to those who threatened the king's peace. Richard Roos's execution was scheduled for April 15th, 1532. The location? Smithfield Market. The method? Boiling alive in a massive iron cauldron in front of a crowd of thousands. London braced itself for something it had never witnessed before. April 15th, 1532. The date is set. The location is chosen. Smithfield Market, just east of the Tower of London. On execution days, Smithfield transforms into something between a marketplace and a theatre of horror. Butchers sell meat at their stalls while crowds gather to watch condemned criminals die. The smell of blood is constant here, from livestock, from executions, from centuries of slaughter soaked into the cobblestones. But today will be different. Today, England will witness something it hasn't seen in generations. Richard Roos has been in the Tower for over a year now. 14 months since the poisoning. 14 months in a stone cell, knowing exactly what's coming. The act of poisoning passed almost immediately after his arrest, but his execution was delayed. Some historians believe the delay was deliberate. Henry wanted time for word to spread. He wanted London to anticipate this moment, to fear it, to talk about nothing else. And it worked. By mid-April, everyone in London knows what's going to happen. Rumours spread through taverns, markets, churches. Some say Roos will be boiled in water. Others claim it will be oil, which burns hotter, clings to skin, prolongs the agony. A few whisper about molten lead, a method so extreme it seems impossible. But the act itself mentions it as an option. Nobody knows for certain, and that uncertainty makes it worse. The crowds begin gathering before dawn. Thousands of people. Merchants close their shops. Servants abandon their duties. Even pregnant women and children push their way through the mob, desperate to see. Public executions are entertainment in Tudor England, but this is different. This isn't a quick hanging or even a beheading. This is something primal, medieval, a punishment that hasn't been used on English soil in living memory. At the center of Smithfield, workers have erected a scaffold. On top of it sits a massive iron cauldron, easily 6 feet across, suspended over a pit filled with wood and kindling. Throughout the morning, servants fill the cauldron with water bucket after bucket, gallon after gallon, until it's nearly full. Then they light the fire. It takes hours for water to boil in a cauldron that size. The crowd watches the flames grow. They watch steam begin to rise. They watch the surface of the water start to shimmer and bubble. And as the water heats, the tension builds. People crane their necks, trying to get a better view. Street vendors sell food and drink. Some spectators treat it like a festival. Others stand in horrified silence, unable to look away. Around midday, the guards appear. They march in formation, surrounding a single figure, Richard Roos. He's bound in chains, his hands shackled, his legs barely able to move. The Chronicle of the Grey Friars of London, one of the few surviving eyewitness accounts, describes him as being tied up in chains and gibbeted, meaning suspended in a cage-like frame that can be raised and lowered. This isn't just an execution. It's theatre, a carefully choreographed display of royal power. Roos is lifted onto the scaffold. The crowd surges forward. Some are shouting, others are silent. He stands above them, looking down at the cauldron, at the water now rolling with violent bubbles, steam rising in thick clouds. He can feel the heat from where he stands. He knows there's no escape, no reprieve, no mercy. The executioner doesn't waste time. Roos is placed in the gibbet, a metal frame, designed to hold a human body suspended, and the mechanism begins to lower him toward the water. Slowly, deliberately, the crowd holds its breath. His feet touch the surface first. The reaction is immediate. Roos screams, a sound so raw, so inhuman, that witnesses will remember it for the rest of their lives. The Chronicle describes how he roared mightily loud. Another account says diverse pregnant women did swoon at the sight of him seething, pregnant women fainting, people collapsing, some turning away, unable to watch. But the executioner doesn't stop. This is part of the design. The gibbet lowers Roos into the boiling water up to his knees, then pulls him out. His skin is already blistering, turning red, peeling away in sheets. The crowd can see it happening. They can hear his screams echoing across Smithfield. Then he's lowered again, deeper this time, up to his waist. The water around him turns pink, then red. His flesh is literally cooking. The Chronicle says he was lowered in and out of the boiling water 3 times until he died. 3 times, each immersion deeper than the last. Modern medical experts who have studied the accounts estimate the entire process took approximately 2 hours. 2 hours of agony, 2 hours of screaming, 2 hours of a man being boiled alive while thousands watched. By the 3rd immersion, Roos was lowered up to his shoulders. At that point, the superheated steam would have entered his lungs, scalding his trachea and bronchi from the inside. His internal organs would have begun to fail. His heart, struggling to pump blood through damaged tissue. His brain, deprived of oxygen, shutting down. Eventually, mercifully, he stopped moving, stopped screaming, stopped being anything recognizable as human. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some people vomited, others wept. Many simply walked away in silence, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Street preachers later claimed it was a sign of God's judgment, a warning against sin. But others whispered that it was something else, a demonstration of what the king could do to anyone who threatened his power. The execution achieved exactly what Henry intended. It terrified England. For years afterward, people spoke about Richard Roos's death in hushed voices. Parents warned their children about the dangers of poison. Servants became paranoid about what they put in their master's food. The message was clear. If you poison someone, anyone, you wouldn't just die. You would be destroyed, publicly, brutally, in a way designed to haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. But Roos wasn't the only victim of Henry's new law. The act of poisoning remained on England's books for 15 more years, and before it was repealed, one more person would face the cauldron at Smithfield. Her name was Margaret Davy, and her story was even darker.
March 17th read, 11 years after Richard Roos's execution. Most of England has tried to forget what happened at Smithfield that day, but the law that killed him remains. The Act for poisoning still sits in England's legal code, waiting unused. A dormant monster. Until Margaret Davy. Her name appears in the records only once, in a single brutal line. Margaret Davy, a young woman, was attainted of high treason for poisoning her mistress and some others, and was boiled to death in Smithfield the 17th of March. That's it. No trial transcript. No detailed confession. No explanation of motive or method. Just her name, her crime, and the manner of her death. History has almost erased her. We don't know how old she was, though records call her young. True, we don't know where she came from or how long she'd worked as a maidservant. We don't even know her mistress's name, the woman she allegedly murdered. Margaret exists only as a ghost in the margins of Tudor history, a footnote to a law created by a paranoid king. But we can piece together fragments. She was a domestic servant. A maid, through lowest rung of Tudor society's ladder. Maids like Margaret lived in their employers' homes, slept in cramped quarters, worked from dawn until long after dark. They emptied chamber pots, scrubbed floors, prepared food, tended fires. They were invisible. Essential, but disposable. If a maid died, the household simply hired another. Life for a Tudor maidservant was brutal. They had no rights, no protection. Master or mistress could beat them, verbally abuse them, withhold food, or worse, sexual assault was common and rarely prosecuted. If a maid became pregnant by her employer, she'd be thrown out into the street, branded as immoral, left to starve. Servants were property, not people. So when the records say Margaret Davy poisoned her mistress and some others, we have to ask, why? Joe, what drove a young woman with no power, no resources, no escape, to commit murder in the most dangerous way possible? Some historians believe it was revenge. Perhaps her mistress was cruel. Perhaps Margaret endured years of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, and finally snapped. Poisoning was the only weapon available to her. She couldn't overpower her mistress in a fight. She couldn't flee without being caught and dragged back. But she could slip something into the food. Something tasteless. Something that would make the pain stop. Others suggest desperation. Maybe Margaret was accused of theft or misconduct and knew she'd be punished severely. Maybe she thought killing her mistress would allow her to escape, to start over somewhere else. She was protecting someone, taking the blame for a crime she didn't commit? We'll never know. But what we do know is this. Once the accusations were made, Margaret's fate was sealed. By 1542, Henry VIII was a different man than the one who'd created the act for poisoning. He was 50 years old, grotesquely obese, suffering from infected leg ulcers that oozed pus and smelled of rot. His paranoia had metastasized into madness. He'd executed 2 of his 6 wives. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howland was constantly surrounded by guards, tasters, physicians. He trusted no one. And his obsession with poison had only grown stronger. When Margaret was arrested and charged with poisoning, there was no question about the outcome. The law was clear. Poisoning equaled treason. Treason equaled boiling alive. No trial. No defense. Just an act of attainder, declaring her guilty and sentencing her to die in the most horrific way the law allowed. Margaret would have been held in Newgate prison while the paperwork was prepared. Newgate was a nightmare. Dark, filthy, overcrowded. Prisoners slept on straw infested with rats and lice. Disease spread like wildfire. The smell human waste, rotting bodies, infection was so overpowering that visitors often vomited. Many prisoners died before they ever reached the scaffold. Margaret survived long enough to be executed. She would have known what was coming. Richard Roots's execution was legend by then, a story told in taverns and marketplaces, embellished with each retelling. Everyone knew about the cauldron at Smithfield. Everyone knew about the screaming. The pregnant women fainting. The 2 hours of agony. Did Margaret sleep the night before? Did she pray? Beg for mercy from guards who wouldn't meet her eyes? We don't know. The records are silent. What we do know is that on the morning of March 17, 1542, Margaret Davy was taken from Newgate to Smithfield. The same location where Ruse had died. The same scaffold. Perhaps even the same cauldron, pulled from storage and filled once again with water. The crowd gathered. Not as large as Ruse's crowd. His execution had been unprecedented, shocking, novel. Margaret's execution was a repeat performance. But still, thousands came. Public executions were free entertainment, and boiling was rare enough to draw spectators from across London. Margaret would have been walked through that crowd in chains. People shouting at her, cursing her, calling her murderess, poisoner, traitor. Some might have thrown refrigerant on vegetables, animal waste, stones. She was young, defenseless, terrified. And she was about to die in front of all of them. The executioner led her onto the scaffold. Below, the cauldron waited, steam rising from its bubbling surface. The fire beneath had been burning for hours, heating the water to a rolling boil. The heat was visible in the air, shimmering, distorting everything beyond it. The mechanism was the same as before. A gibbet metal frame designed to suspend a human body was lowered over the cauldron. Margaret was placed inside, her arms and legs bound to prevent thrashing. And then, slowly, deliberately, the executioner began to lower her toward the water. What went through her mind in those final moments? Did she scream? Did she pray? Did she think about her mistress, the woman she'd allegedly killed? Or did she simply close her eyes and wait for the pain to begin? The crowd held its breath. The gibbet descended, and Margaret Davy became the last person in English history to be boiled alive.
The cauldron itself was a weapon, 6 feet across, made of iron or copper, thick enough to withstand intense heat without cracking. It had to be large enough to submerge a human body completely, deep enough that the victim couldn't touch the bottom and push themselves up. These weren't improvised tools. They were purpose-built instruments of torture, commissioned by the Crown, forged by blacksmiths who understood exactly what they were creating. Before the execution, workers would fill the cauldron with liquid, usually water, the simplest option, readily available, easy to heat, but sometimes oil, or tar, or molten lead. Each substance had its own horrifying properties. Water boiled at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to scald skin instantly, but slow enough to prolong suffering. Oil reached higher temperatures, clung to flesh, caused deeper burns that penetrated muscle tissue. Tar was thick, sticky, impossible to wipe away. It coated the victim's skin like a second layer, trapping heat, amplifying pain. Molten lead was the worst. It melted at over 600 degrees, and when it touched skin, the tissue didn't just burn, it vaporized. The records don't always specify which liquid was used. For Richard Ruse, most historians believe it was water. For Margaret Davy, we simply don't know. But whatever the substance, the process was the same. First came the fire. Hours before the execution, workers would build a massive pyre beneath the cauldron. Logs stacked carefully, kindling wedged between them, coal added for sustained heat. Lighting it was a ceremony in itself. The crowd would watch the flames grow, see the smoke rise, feel the temperature in Smithfield increase degree by degree. The anticipation was part of the punishment. Everyone knew what was coming. As the liquid heated, it would begin to shimmer, small bubbles forming at the bottom, rising, breaking the surface, then larger bubbles, then a rolling ball, violent, chaotic, steam pouring off in thick white clouds. The air around the cauldron would become almost unbreathable. The heat would force spectators to step back, to shield their faces, but they wouldn't leave. They'd paid for this spectacle with their time and attention, and they intended to see it through. The victim would be brought onto the scaffold in chains, hands bound, feet shackled, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes not. The executioner would place them in the gibbet, a metal frame designed specifically for this purpose. It looked like a cage, with bars running vertically and horizontally, creating a lattice that held the body in place while allowing the liquid to reach every inch of skin. The victim's arms would be secured at their sides, their legs strapped together. They couldn't thrash, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. The gibbet was attached to a pulley system, chains running through iron wheels mounted on wooden beams above the cauldron. This allowed the executioner to control the descent, slowly, deliberately, drawing out every moment. Some executioners preferred the gradual method. They would lower the victim into cold or lukewarm liquid first, then light the fire beneath the cauldron while the victim was already submerged. The temperature would rise slowly degree by degree, minute by minute. The victim would feel it happening. The warmth becoming heat, the heat becoming pain, the pain becoming unbearable. By the time the water reached boiling, they would have been screaming for an hour or more, begging for death, praying for unconsciousness that wouldn't come. Others chose the immersion method. The liquid would already be boiling when the victim arrived. The executioner would lower the gibbet slowly, feet first. The reaction was instantaneous. Skin contact with boiling water causes third-degree burns within seconds. The outer layer of skin, the epidermis, dies immediately. Nerve endings fire all at once, sending overwhelming pain signals to the brain. The victim's screams would echo across Smithfield, audible blocks away. But the executioner wouldn't stop there. The gibbet would descend further. Ankles, calves, knees. Each inch brought new agony. The flesh would begin to turn red, then white, then start to peel away in sheets. Muscle tissue would be exposed. Blood vessels would burst. The liquid around the victim would turn pink, then red, clouding with fat and tissue. Then the executioner would reverse the pulley, pull the victim back up, let them dangle above the cauldron, steaming, dripping, their lower body ruined beyond recognition. The crowd would see everything. The blistered skin, the exposed muscle, the shaking, the sobbing, the desperate gasping for air. And then the executioner would lower them again, deeper this time, up to the waist. The process repeated. Skin cooking, flesh falling away, internal organs beginning to fail. The victim's core temperature would spike. Heat stroke would set in. Dehydration, shock. Their body would try to shut down, to protect itself. But the pain would keep them conscious, aware, suffering. Medieval medical experts who have studied the accounts estimate that immersion up to the waist would cause irreversible damage within minutes. The kidneys would begin to fail. The liver would stop processing toxins. Blood pressure would drop dangerously low. But death wouldn't come yet. The human body is horrifyingly resilient. It can endure more pain than seems possible. The third immersion would be the deepest, up to the neck or shoulders. At this point, the superheated steam would enter the victim's mouth and nose. It would scald the trachea, the bronchi, the delicate tissues of the lungs. Breathing would become impossible. Oxygen deprivation would finally bring unconsciousness. And then, mercifully, death. The entire process could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the executioner's method and the victim's physical condition. Contemporary witnesses described it as the most horrific thing they'd ever seen. Pregnant women fainted. Hardened soldiers turned away. Street preachers declared it proof of God's wrath. Others whispered that it was something worse, proof of man's capacity for cruelty. The smell was unforgettable. Burning flesh has a distinct odor, sweet and sickening, like roasted meat but wrong, corrupted. It would hang over Smithfield for hours after the execution ended. People living nearby would close their windows, stuff rags in the gaps, try to keep it out, but it seeped in anyway, clinging to clothing, to hair, to memory. The body would be left in the cauldron until it stopped moving. Then it would be hauled out, no longer recognizable as human, just cooked meat and bone, and disposed of without ceremony. No burial, no grave, just ashes and horror. Smithfield had seen death before. Hundreds of deaths, thousands maybe. For over 4 centuries, this open space on the edge of London had served as the city's primary execution ground. Heretics burned at the stake, traitors hand-drawn and quartered, common criminals dangling from gallows until their necks snapped. The ground itself was stained with blood, soaked so deep that nothing would ever wash it clean. But this was different. The crowd gathering on April 15th, 1532, knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. Word had spread for weeks through taverns and markets, whispered in alleys and shouted from street corners. The cook who poisoned Bishop Fisher's household would die by boiling, alive, in a cauldron, at Smithfield. Many had dismissed it as rumour, impossible to believe. England hadn't seen an execution like this in living memory. But the scaffold was real. The cauldron was real. The fire burning beneath it was real. They came in droves. Merchants abandoning their shops. Labourers leaving their work sites. Servants sneaking away from their masters' homes. Even pregnant women, despite warnings from midwives and priests, pushed their way through the crowd to secure a view. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders. The wealthy paid for seats in upper windows overlooking Smithfield, turning the execution into theatre, a performance with the best seats reserved for those who could afford them. Public executions in Tudor England were complicated affairs. They weren't just punishment, they were social events, moral lessons, entertainment. and spectacle rolled into one. The crowd didn't come solely to see someone die. They came to judge the condemned, to witness justice, to feel the weight of the law, to remind themselves that they were among the living and not the dying. But the mood at Ruse's execution was different from typical hangings or beheadings. There was tension in the air, unease. People jostled for position. Yes, but they were quieter than usual, less raucous. Even the street vendors selling meat pies and ale seemed subdued, as if they sensed that what was about to happen would cross a line. When Ruse was brought onto the scaffold, the crowd erupted. Shouts, curses, some calling him murderer, poisoner, traitor, others simply screaming incoherently, caught up in mob mentality. But there were also pockets of silence, people staring in morbid fascination, unable to speak, unable to process what they were seeing. Ruse himself, chained, bound, placed in the gibbet, looked small against the backdrop of the massive cauldron. The Chronicle of the Greyfriars of London, one of the only surviving eyewitness accounts, describes him being tied up in chains and gibbeted, the metal frame holding him suspended above the boiling water like a grotesque puppet. The executioner tested the pulley system one final time, ensuring everything would work smoothly. This wasn't amateur work. This was precision cruelty. The moment Ruse's feet touched the water, everything changed. He screamed. The Chronicle records that he roared mightily loud. Not a cry, not a shout, a roar. A sound so raw, so primal, that it cut through the noise of the crowd like a blade. People stopped shouting, stopped moving. The entire square fell silent except for Ruse's screaming and the crackling of the fire beneath the cauldron. Then came the reactions. Pregnant women began to faint. Not one or two, but multiple women collapsing in the crowd, their bodies hitting the cobblestones. Witnesses rushed to help them, dragging them away from the press of bodies, fanning their faces, calling for water. Some contemporary accounts suggest these women went into early labor from the shock, though we have no way to verify that. What we do know is that the sight of Ruse being boiled alive was so horrific that it caused physical reactions in spectators. Hardened men soldiers, butchers, laborers who'd seen death before turned away. Some vomited, others simply stood frozen, faces pale, unable to believe what they were witnessing. This wasn't clean. This wasn't quick. This was deliberate, calculated torture happening in broad daylight, sanctioned by the Crown, cheered on by the law. The executioner continued his work, lowering Ruse into the water up to his knees, pulling him back up, his skin already blistering, peeling, the flesh underneath red and raw, then lowering him again, deeper, up to his waist, the water around him turning cloudy with blood and fat. His screams never stopped. For 2 hours, witnesses said. 2 hours of a human being cooked alive while thousands watched. Some in the crowd began to pray, not for justice, but for mercy, for God to end Ruse's suffering. Street preachers, always present at executions to offer moral commentary, shouted about divine punishment and the wages of sin. But their voices sounded hollow, uncertain. Even they seemed shaken by what they were seeing. Others couldn't look away. There's a dark curiosity in human nature, a compulsion to witness horror even when every instinct screams to turn away. People who later swore they'd closed their eyes admitted they'd watched through their fingers. Parents who'd brought children realized too late that this was no ordinary execution, that what their sons and daughters were seeing would haunt them for years. By the third immersion, when Ruse was lowered up to his shoulders, the crowd had thinned. People leaving, unable to take any more. Those who remained watched in stunned silence as his movements slowed, then stopped. When the executioner finally declared him dead and hauled the body from the cauldron, what emerged was no longer recognizable as human, just cooked meat and bone, steaming in the April air. The aftermath was strange. Typically, executions ended with the crowd dispersing quickly, returning to their lives, gossiping about what they'd seen. But after Ruse's death, people lingered, standing in small groups, talking in hushed voices, some crying, others simply staring at the now empty cauldron, trying to process what they'd witnessed. The Chronicle notes that the execution sickened many spectators, an unusual admission for a time when public death was commonplace. Other accounts describe people having nightmares for weeks afterward. The smell burning flesh, boiling blood hung over Smithfield for days, seeping into homes, clinging to clothing. Residents complained to authorities, demanding the area be cleaned, but the stench lingered. The execution achieved its purpose. London was terrified. Servants became paranoid about what they prepared in their kitchens. Nobles increased their security. The message was clear. Henry's law had teeth. and those teeth were sharp enough to destroy you in the most unimaginable way possible. Henry didn't invent boiling alive. The method existed in fragments across medieval Europe, used sporadically, whispered about in dark corners of history. But what Henry did was weaponize it. He took an obscure, nearly forgotten punishment and transformed it into a systematic tool of psychological warfare. The act for poisoning wasn't just about justice. It was about creating a terror so visceral, so unforgettable, that it would reshape the behavior of an entire nation. Every execution under Henry's reign served multiple purposes. This was theatre. Performance. A carefully choreographed display of royal power where the condemned played their assigned role and the crowd became unwilling participants in a lesson about obedience. Hangings were quick. Beheadings were clean. Even being hanged, drawn, and quartered brutal as it was followed a predictable pattern. The condemned knew what to expect. The crowd had seen it before. But boiling was different. It broke the script. The psychological impact began long before the condemned ever reached Smithfield. Once sentenced to boiling, prisoners lived in absolute dread. Days or weeks in a cell, knowing exactly what awaited them. No uncertainty about method. No hope for a quick death. Just the certainty of prolonged, unimaginable agony. This waiting period was intentional. Henry wanted the condemned to break mentally before they broke physically. Fear served as its own form of punishment, and the terror wasn't confined to the prisoner. It radiated outward, infecting everyone connected to the case. Richard Roos's fellow servants, the staff at Bishop Fisher's household, they all knew they could have been accused. One mistake, one moment of carelessness in the kitchen, and they could be next. That realization changed behavior instantly. Servants became paranoid. They watched each other constantly. Trust evaporated. The kitchen, once a space of routine work, became a zone of suspicion. This was exactly what Henry wanted. Control through fear, obedience through terror. The boiling law didn't just punish past crimes, it prevented future ones by making the cost of transgression unbearable. The public nature of the execution amplified its impact exponentially. Henry could have ordered Roos and Davy executed privately, disposed of quietly in the Tower, but that would have wasted their value as symbols. Public execution transformed individual punishment into collective trauma. Thousands witnessed the boiling. Thousands more heard about it from those who were there. Stories spread through taverns, markets, churches. The details became legend, growing more horrific with each retelling. Pregnant women fainting, men vomiting, the screams audible blocks away. The smell of burning flesh hanging over Smithfield for days. These weren't unfortunate side effects of the punishment, they were features, designed elements meant to embed themselves in collective memory. Anyone tempted to poison an enemy would remember those stories, would imagine themselves in that cauldron, and would choose another path. The method itself was calculated for maximum suffering. Boiling didn't kill quickly like beheading, or instantly like a well-placed arrow. It destroyed the body systematically, layer by layer, while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. The gradual immersion technique, lowering the condemned partway into the water, pulling them back up, then lowering them deeper, extended the agony deliberately. It gave spectators time to absorb what they were seeing, time to internalize the horror, time to understand that this could happen to anyone. Henry understood crowd psychology better than most rulers of his era. He knew that witnessing extreme violence created a form of psychological submission. The crowd that watched Richard Roos boil became complicit in his death simply by being present. They couldn't unsee what they'd witnessed. It lived in their minds permanently, creating a permanent association between disobedience and suffering. Every time they thought about challenging the king's authority, they would remember Smithfield, remember the screaming, remember the smell. This psychological warfare extended beyond execution itself into the architecture of daily life. The law remained on the books for 15 years, even though only 2 people were ever executed under it. Those 15 years were marked by constant awareness that boiling existed as a possibility. Servants handling food knew. Nobles at court knew. Everyone knew that if someone died from suspected poisoning, the accused wouldn't just be killed, they would be destroyed publicly and horrifically. That knowledge changed society in measurable ways. Records from the period show a dramatic decrease in suspected poisoning cases after 1531. Whether actual poisonings declined or people simply became more careful about accusations is unclear, but the cultural shift was real. Poison, already considered the coward's weapon, became associated with the worst possible death. The stigma intensified. The fear deepened. Henry also understood that different crimes required different punishments to maximize their symbolic impact. Treason against the crown resulted in hanging, drawing, and quartering, a ritualized dismemberment that emphasized the body's subordination to state power. Heresy resulted in burning, a purification through fire, a destruction that left minimal physical remains. But poisoning was intimate, secret, domestic. It happened in homes, in kitchens, in spaces where people should feel safe. So the punishment had to violate that intimacy, had to take place in a public marketplace, had to transform the private act of murder into a public spectacle of suffering. The cauldron itself, a domestic tool used for cooking food, became an instrument of death. This inversion was purposeful. It connected the crime to its punishment in viewers' minds. Every time a household servant looked at a cooking pot afterward, they would think of Smithfield, think of ruse, think of consequences. Modern historians have debated whether Henry's use of boiling constituted genuine deterrence or simply satisfied his paranoid cruelty. The truth is probably both. Henry was genuinely terrified of poison. His elaborate precautions, taste testers, bed inspections, constant surveillance reveal a man living in perpetual fear. But he was also a master manipulator who understood how to leverage his personal fears into political control. The boiling executions served his psychological needs by externalizing his terror, projecting it onto others, forcing the entire kingdom to share his paranoia. But they also served his political needs by demonstrating absolute power, by showing that he could not only kill, but could kill in ways that traumatized witnesses for life. In the end, the act for poisoning achieved exactly what Henry intended. It created a culture of fear so pervasive that poison became nearly unthinkable as a murder method. It established royal authority as something beyond mere law, as something capable of inflicting unimaginable suffering on those who transgressed. And it ensured that Henry's legacy would include not just political transformation and religious upheaval, but also some of the most brutal executions in English history. January 28, 1547. Henry VIII dies at Whitehall Palace. His body, grotesque, bloated, riddled with infection, is carried away for burial while England holds its breath. The tyrant is dead. The paranoid king who executed wives, advisors, friends, and thousands of nameless subjects has finally succumbed to the diseases ravaging his flesh. He leaves behind a 9-year-old son to inherit the throne, Edward VIII, a child, pale, thin, serious beyond his years, raised in the shadow of his father's violence, but not yet corrupted by it. The boy king's coronation happens quickly. Power shifts immediately to a regency council led by his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and one of their first acts is to examine Henry's legal legacy. The dozens of laws passed during his reign, many of them draconian, brutal, designed to maintain control through terror. The act for poisoning stands out immediately, not because it was used frequently. Only 2 documented executions occurred under it, but because of what it represented. The law's very existence was a wound in England's legal code, a reminder of Henry's paranoia made manifest. The Regency Council convenes Parliament. They need to address this. The debate happens behind closed doors, so we don't have transcripts. But the resulting legislation speaks volumes. In 1547, during Edward's first Parliament, the Treason Act is passed. Section by section, it systematically dismantles much of Henry's legal framework. And when it comes to the act for poisoning, the language is remarkable. The new law describes Henry's boiling statute as very straight, sore, extreme, and terrible. These aren't casual words. This is official parliamentary language condemning the previous king's law as excessively cruel. Straight meaning restrictive, inflexible. Sore meaning painful, grievous. Extreme needing no explanation. And terrible, not in the modern sense of bad, but in the original meaning, terror-inducing, designed to create fear. Parliament recognizes what Henry had created, a punishment so brutal that it traumatized witnesses, so disproportionate that it violated emerging notions of justice, so politically convenient that it allowed the crown to bypass common law and execute people without proper trials. The boiling law had to go. The repeal happened swiftly. Poisoning is reclassified from high treason to felony. This changes everything. As felony, it falls under standard criminal law. Trials become mandatory. Evidence must be presented. The accused have the right to defend themselves, and the punishment reverts to hanging for men, burning for women, still brutal by modern standards, but comparatively quick and familiar within Tudor legal tradition. The cauldron at Smithfield is dismantled, or perhaps stored away, eventually melted down for metal. No record survives of what happened to the actual execution equipment. It simply vanishes from history, along with the immediate threat it represented. But the repeal raises questions historians have debated for centuries. Why did Parliament move so quickly to eliminate boiling? If the method was such an effective deterrent, and by all accounts, it terrified England, why abandon it? The simple answer is that Edward's Regency Council wanted to distance the new reign from Henry's excesses. The boy king needed to be seen as merciful, temperate, just. Keeping his father's most brutal laws would undermine that image. This was political calculation, a careful rebranding of royal authority. But there's a deeper answer. The boiling law had failed in a fundamental way. It was supposed to prevent poisoning by making the consequences unbearable. Yet the executions themselves became the problem. They were too brutal, too dramatic. They crossed a line that even hardened Tudor audiences found difficult to accept. Remember the pregnant women fainting at Rose's execution, the men vomiting, the people turning away, unable to watch. These were signs of effective deterrence. They were signs that the punishment had exceeded society's capacity to absorb it. The execution became the atrocity, overshadowing the original crime. People stopped talking about what Richard Roose had done and started talking about what was done to him. This created an unintended consequence. Instead of reinforcing royal authority, the boiling executions subtly undermined it. They made Henry look cruel, not strong, paranoid, not protective. The method was so extreme that it prompted questions about the king's judgment, his stability, his fitness to rule. Those questions were whispered in Henry's lifetime, never spoken aloud. But once he was dead, they could be acknowledged. Edward's parliament recognized this. They understood that boiling alive was a relic of Henry's personal madness, not a necessary tool of governance. England could maintain order without cooking people in cauldrons. Justice could be served through less traumatic means. The legal system could function without bypassing trials and due process. There's also evidence that religious reform played a role. Edward's reign marked a significant shift toward Protestantism. The Regency Council included reformers who believed in mercy, redemption, proportional punishment. The Catholic tradition under Henry had emphasized suffering as spiritually significant pain as penance, agony as atonement. But Protestant theology moved away from that framework. Suffering became less central. Justice became more procedural, less theatrical. The phrase, without benefit of clergy, in Henry's original act particularly troubled reformers. It meant the condemned couldn't receive last rites, couldn't confess their sins, couldn't be spiritually prepared for death. To Protestant minds, this was unconscionable. Even the worst criminal deserved a chance at salvation. Denying them that chance made the state complicit in damning souls, not just ending lives. So the repeal happened for multiple reasons: political calculation, moral revulsion, religious reform, legal rationalization, all converging at a moment when England had the opportunity to change course. The reaction to the repeal was telling. There are no recorded protests, no pamphlets arguing that boiling should be retained, no public outcry demanding harsher punishments for poisoners. The silence speaks volumes. England was relieved, glad to let the cauldron disappear, happy to forget that such a law had ever existed. Of course, Tudor England remained brutal. Executions continued. Hangings, burnings, beheadings, all the traditional methods persisted. Edward's reign would see heretics burned at the stake, traitors hanged and quartered, criminals executed in public spectacles. The repeal of boiling didn't suddenly make England gentle or humane by modern standards, but it did eliminate the most extreme punishment on the books. It drew a line, however faint, suggesting that some forms of state violence were excessive, even by Tudor standards. That line mattered. It established precedent, and it ensured that no one in England would ever again be boiled alive by lawful decree. The act for poisoning had lasted 15 years. 2 people died under it, and then it was gone, repealed by a 9-year-old King's Parliament, condemned as too terrible to continue. The act for poisoning existed for 15 years. During that time, England, a nation obsessed with crime and punishment, with public executions happening weekly. In London alone, used boiling only twice. Twice, out of hundreds, perhaps thousands of executions during Henry's reign. This wasn't because poisoning disappeared. Cases continued to surface. Accusations continued to fly. Suspects continued to be arrested. But boiling as punishment quietly faded from use even before it was officially repealed. Why? The official answer is that poisoning was rare. Henry's own act acknowledged this, describing the crime as something that had been most rare and seldom committed or practiced in England. But rarity doesn't explain why a law specifically created for a crime would go almost entirely unused. If poisoning was so rare and Henry was so paranoid about it, every single accusation should have triggered the full force of the boiling law. Yet it didn't. After Margaret Davy in 1542, the cauldron disappeared from Smithfield permanently, 5 years before the law was repealed. The real reason boiling failed is simpler and darker. It was too effective at the wrong thing. The punishment was designed to deter poisoning through terror, make the consequences so horrific that no one would dare attempt the crime. In theory, this made sense. Public executions worked as deterrents precisely because they were public visible reminders of what happened to criminals. The more brutal the execution, the more powerful the message. But boiling crossed a threshold. It stopped being a deterrent and became a spectacle of state cruelty. The execution itself became more memorable, more discussed, more historically significant than the crime it punished. People remembered Richard Roos not because he poisoned Bishop Fisher's household, but because of how he died. The method overshadowed the message. This created a credibility problem for the crown. Henry wanted to be seen as England's protector, the strong king who kept his subjects safe from invisible threats like poison. But executing people by boiling made him look unstable, paranoid, cruel beyond necessity, even by Tudor standards, an era that accepted hanging, drawing, quartering, and burning as normal. Boiling seemed excessive. Contemporary legal scholars noticed this almost immediately. The act passed in 1531, but criticism began within years. Edward Coke, Chief Justice under King James I decades later, famously said the Poisoning Act was too severe to live long. That phrase, too severe, is remarkable coming from a Tudor-era legal mind. These were men who routinely sentenced people to brutal deaths. For them to describe boiling as too severe meant it had violated some unspoken boundary of acceptable cruelty. The practical problems were equally significant. Boiling required extensive preparation. The cauldron had to be transported to Smithfield, mounted on the scaffold, filled with hundreds of gallons of liquid, heated for hours before the execution. This took manpower, resources, time, and coordination. Compare that to hanging, which required only a rope and a beam, or beheading, which needed an executioner and a block. Boiling was logistically complicated, expensive, and inefficient. And for what? The deterrent effect was questionable at best. There's no evidence that boiling actually prevented poisoning cases. If anything, the existence of the law might have made people more paranoid, more likely to suspect poison when someone fell ill, more willing to make false accusations knowing the accused would face unimaginable punishment. This created potential for abuse. A servant with a grudge could claim their master died from poison rather than natural causes. A rival could accuse an enemy, knowing the mere accusation might be enough to trigger an investigation, arrest, and possibly execution without trial. Henry's use of acts of attainder declaring someone guilty without trial compounded these problems. Richard Roos never had a chance to defend himself, to present evidence, to question witnesses. He was simply declared guilty by parliamentary decree and sentenced to die. This violated emerging principles of due process that were slowly, painfully taking root in English law. Even in Henry's time, legal scholars were uncomfortable with attainder being used for common criminals rather than fleeing political enemies. The social impact was also counterproductive. The executions traumatized witnesses so severely that people became reluctant to attend. Public executions relied on crowds for their effectiveness. The crowd served as witness, jury, moral chorus. They validated the state's actions through their presence. But if people started avoiding executions because they were too horrific, the system lost its power. And that's exactly what began happening after Roos's execution. Accounts describe people fainting, vomiting, fleeing the scene. These aren't the reactions of a population being effectively deterred. These are the reactions of a population being brutalized. There's a difference. Deterrence requires the audience to internalize the message. This could be me if I commit this crime, so I won't commit it. But brutalization produces only trauma. I never want to think about what I just saw ever again. The religious dimensions also worked against the law's effectiveness. The phrase, without benefit of clergy, meant the condemned couldn't receive last rites, couldn't confess their sins, could achieve spiritual preparation before death. In deeply Catholic Tudor England, and later Protestant England under Edward. This was profoundly disturbing. It suggested the state was condemning not just the body but the soul. This made religious leaders uncomfortable. Parish priests, bishops, even church reformers began questioning whether any earthly authority should have that power. By the time Edward VII's Parliament convened in 1547, consensus had formed. The boiling law had to go, not just because it was brutal, but because it had failed to accomplish its stated purpose. It hadn't prevented poisoning. It hadn't strengthened Henry's authority. It hadn't improved English law. It had simply created two horrific executions that traumatized witnesses and embarrassed the crown. The repeal was unanimous. No one argued for keeping boiling on the books. The parliamentary description, very straight, sore, extreme, and terrible, said everything that needed saying. The law was too severe, too inflexible, too cruel. It violated emerging ideas about proportional punishment, about mercy, about the limits of state violence. Other brutal punishments survived. Hanging, burning, quartering all continued for centuries after boiling was abolished. Why? Because they had limitations. Hanging was quick. Burning, while horrific, had religious justification as purification by fire. Quartering was reserved for the most serious treason against the crown. Each punishment had boundaries, precedents, social acceptance. Boiling had none of these. It was purely an instrument of terror, created by a paranoid king to address his personal fears. It had no historical precedent in English law, no religious justification, no proportionality. It was simply too much. And so it ended, quietly, without protest or controversy. England moved on, trying to forget that such a law had ever existed. The cauldrons were dismantled or repurposed. The scaffold at Smithfield returned to hosting conventional executions, and boiling alive disappeared from English legal history, remembered only as a horrific footnote to Henry VIII's paranoid reign. The response to the Act for Poisoning began the moment it was announced. February 1531. Parliament passes the law declaring that murder by poison is now high treason, punishable by boiling alive. The news spreads through London within hours, and the reaction is immediate, visceral, complex. At first, there's shock. Boiling alive. In England, the punishment sounds medieval, barbaric, something from a different age. England had hanged criminals for centuries, beheaded nobles and royalty, even employed hanging, drawing, and quartering for the worst traitors. But boiling, that belonged to darker histories, foreign lands, places where civilization hadn't yet taken root. Or so people thought. The nobility, particularly those close to Bishop Fisher, expressed quiet support. Fisher was one of their own, a powerful religious figure who nearly died from poison. The attack on him felt like an attack on the entire social order. If a bishop could be poisoned in his own home by his own staff, who is safe? Nobles begin looking at their servants differently, questioning their cooks, wondering which member of their household might be bribed, coerced, or motivated to slip something deadly into the evening meal. This paranoia is exactly what Henry wanted. The law wasn't just about punishment, it was about control, making everyone feel vulnerable, making trust impossible. When people are afraid, they become easier to govern. They look to the crown for protection, for strength, for decisive action. And Henry provided exactly that, even if the action was horrific beyond measure. But the common people react differently. For servants, especially kitchen staff, the law is terrifying. They know how easy it would be to be falsely accused. A master dies unexpectedly? Blame the cook. A mistress falls ill after dinner? Accuse the maid. The new law means there's no trial, no chance to defend yourself, just an act of attainder declaring you guilty and sentencing you to unimaginable death. Kitchen workers become hyper-vigilant. They start documenting everything they prepare, having witnesses present when they handle food. Some refuse to use certain spices or ingredients that could be mistaken for poison if someone falls ill. The atmosphere in noble households shifts from routine to constant surveillance. Trust evaporates. Everyone watches everyone else. The religious community is divided. Some priests and bishops support the law as divine justice, God's wrath manifested through earthly authority. They preach sermons about the sanctity of life, the evil of poison, the righteousness of severe punishment. But others are deeply uncomfortable. The phrase, without benefit of clergy, haunts theological discussions. It means the condemned can't receive last rites, can't confess their sins, can't prepare their soul for judgment. This troubles even hardline Catholic clergy. Church doctrine holds that every sinner deserves a chance at redemption, that confession and penance can save even the worst criminal's soul. But the boiling law denies that chance. It suggests the state has authority over not just life and death, but salvation itself. Some theologians quietly argue this is heresy, that Henry has overstepped, that no earthly king should have power to condemn souls as well as bodies. These concerns remain mostly private. Speaking openly against the king's law is dangerous, but the whispers persist, growing louder after Richard Roos's execution. When Roos is actually boiled at Smithfield in April 1532, public opinion shifts dramatically. The theory of boiling as punishment is one thing. The reality is something else entirely. Witnesses emerge from Smithfield traumatized. They describe the screaming, the smell, the pregnant women fainting, the men vomiting. These aren't exaggerations or embellishments, these are factual accounts recorded in multiple sources. The Chronicle of the Grey Friars describes how Roos roared mightily loud, and how diverse women being great with child did swoon at the sight of his seething. Contemporary pamphlets and broadsheets, the Tudor equivalent of newspapers, spread these details throughout England. Within weeks, everyone from Cornwall to Yorkshire knows what happened at Smithfield. The reaction is complicated. Some people express satisfaction that justice was served, that the poisoner got what he deserved. These tend to be people who didn't witness the execution, who can maintain their abstract support for harsh punishment without confronting its reality. But those who actually saw it, or spoke to people who did, react with horror and disgust. Tavern conversations shift. Initially, people discuss Roos's crime, what he did, why he did it, whether Bishop Fisher was the target. But increasingly, the conversations focus on the execution itself, how long it took, how much he suffered, whether any crime, even murder, deserves that level of agony. These are dangerous questions to ask aloud, but they're being asked. Some contemporary accounts suggest that attendance at subsequent executions at Smithfield temporarily decreased. People who regularly attended public executions, viewing them as entertainment or moral education, began avoiding them, afraid they might witness another boiling. This was problematic for the Crown. Public executions relied on large crowds to be effective. Empty scaffolds undermined the entire system. The merchant and artisan classes, London's growing middle class, are particularly conflicted. Many support law and order, want harsh punishments for serious crimes, believe the king has a duty to protect his subjects. But they also value proportionality, fairness, the idea that punishment should fit the crime. And boiling seems disproportionate even to them. It's one thing to hang a murderer. It's another to cook them alive for hours while thousands watch. Legal scholars and lawyers begin discussing the act in private. They note its unusual features: the retroactive application to Roos, the use of attainder instead of trial, the classification of poisoning as treason. Some argue this sets dangerous precedents. If the king can retroactively declare something treason and execute someone without trial for it, what's to stop him from doing that for other crimes? For any crime, for political opposition, these concerns are prescient. Over the next decade, Henry will expand the definition of treason repeatedly, using it to eliminate political enemies, religious dissenters, even former advisors and wives. The boiling law is part of a broader pattern of legal innovation, designed to concentrate power in the crown at the expense of traditional legal protections. By the time Margaret Davy is boiled in 1542, public opinion has largely turned against the practice. The execution happens, but with less fanfare, smaller crowds, fewer contemporary accounts. It's as if England wants to forget it's happening. There's a collective exhaustion with brutality, a sense that Henry's reign has become defined by violence and paranoia rather than strength and justice. When Henry dies in 1547 and Edward's Parliament moves to repeal the law, there's no public outcry to keep it. No petitions defending boiling as necessary. No pamphlets arguing for its continuation. The silence is telling. England is ready to let this horror go. 15 years, from February 1531 to March 1547. That's how long the Act for Poisoning remained on England's statute books. In historical terms, it's barely a moment. But those 15 years left a permanent scar on English legal history and collective memory. During those years, England lived under the constant shadow of the boiling law. Even though only 2 people were ever executed under it, the threat existed. The cauldron might have been dismantled after Margaret Davy's death, but the law remained. Any accusation of poisoning, any suspicious death, any servant accused by a paranoid master all carried the possibility of ending in that cauldron. This created a climate of fear that extended far beyond actual poisoning cases. Household servants, particularly those who handled food, lived in constant anxiety. One mistake, one accident, One coincidental illness after a meal could lead to accusations, and accusations under Henry's system didn't require evidence or trial. An act of attainder could declare someone guilty based purely on the king's word and parliament's compliance. The law fundamentally changed relationships within Tudor households. Trust between masters and servants eroded. Where once a cook might improvise with ingredients, experiment with recipes, try new spices, they now documented everything obsessively. Witnesses were required, second opinions fought. Kitchen staff began working in pairs, never alone, always with someone who could testify on their behalf if something went wrong. Noble families started rotating their kitchen staff more frequently, believing that loyalty built over years might not protect them from a servant bribed or coerced by enemies. Some households dismissed all their servants and hired entirely new staffs, thinking this would somehow make them safer. It didn't. It just created more unemployment and more desperate servants willing to take risks. The paranoia spread beyond kitchens into every aspect of domestic life. Chamberlains who prepared beds, physicians who prescribed medicines, even apothecaries selling herbs came under suspicion. Anything that went into a body food, drink, medicine became a potential murder weapon, and anyone who handled those things became a potential murderer. This wasn't sustainable. Society couldn't function when everyone suspected everyone else of plotting murder. Trade suffered because merchants feared their rivals might poison them to eliminate competition. Social gatherings became strained as hosts worried about serving food to guests. The fundamental social contracts that allowed Tudor society to operate began fraying. Legal scholars watched this deterioration with growing concern. They recognized that the act for poisoning was part of a broader pattern in Henry's reign. The expansion of treason to cover more and more offences, the use of attainder to bypass trials, the concentration of judicial power in the crown at the expense of common law protections. Between 1530 and 1547, Henry created or expanded 11 different capital statutes related to treason. Each one gave the crown more authority to execute people with less oversight. Denying royal supremacy became treason. Speaking against the king's marriages became treason. Even accidentally causing the death of a pregnant woman could be reclassified as treason if the crown wanted it to be. The poisoning law fit perfectly into this framework. It took a crime that had traditionally been handled as felony subject to standard criminal proceedings, trials by jury, rules of evidence, and elevated it to treason. This meant the crown could intervene directly, could use attainder, could execute without the inconvenience of proving guilt in court. Some historians believe this was Henry's true purpose all along, that the Roos case gave him an excuse to expand treason law further, to remove more legal protections, to make it easier to eliminate enemies. The fact that Fisher, the man who nearly died, was himself executed for treason for years later suggests a darker agenda. Henry used the attack on Fisher to create a law, then used other laws to kill Fisher himself. The whole thing feels like orchestration rather than genuine concern for justice. But whether intentional or opportunistic, the result was the same. The act for poisoning became another tool of state terror, not because it was frequently used, but because it could be used at any time against anyone, for any suspicious death that the crown wanted to prosecute. The law's presence in the statute books gave authorities leverage in investigations, even if they never intended to charge someone with treason and execute them by boiling. The mere possibility of that outcome made suspects more cooperative, more willing to confess, more likely to implicate others. The psychological pressure of knowing the worst possible punishment existed was sometimes more useful than actually imposing it. This is why the law lasted 15 years despite only being used twice. It served its purpose not through application but through existence. It hung over England like a storm cloud, changing behaviour, shaping decisions, creating fear. When Edward VII's Parliament finally repealed it in 1547, they did so with language that's remarkable for its directness. They called the act very straight, sore, extreme, and terrible. This wasn't casual description, this was official parliamentary condemnation of a previous king's law. It's extremely rare for one parliament to so explicitly criticize another's legislation, especially when that legislation came from a king as powerful as Henry VIII. But Edward's Regency Council felt safe making that criticism because Henry was dead, and they felt compelled to make it because the law had become an embarrassment. England was trying to move forward, to distance itself from Henry's worst excesses, to present itself as a civilized nation with proper legal systems. The boiling law contradicted all of that. It made England look barbaric, paranoid, cruel. The repeal reclassified poisoning as felony rather than treason. This restored traditional legal protections. Trials became mandatory. Evidence had to be presented. Defendants could mount defenses. And the punishment reverted to hanging for men. Burning for women still brutal, but at least familiar, established. Part of England's long legal tradition rather than an innovation of fear. The speed of the repeal is telling. Edward's first parliament, meeting just months after Henry's death, immediately addressed the poisoning law. It was clearly a priority, something that needed to be eliminated quickly before it could be used again, before another paranoid monarch could revive it. And it worked. Boiling alive never returned to English law. It became a historical curiosity, a dark footnote, a reminder of what happens when fear drives legislation. Future legal scholars would reference it as an example of excessive punishment, of laws that crossed moral boundaries, of state power gone wrong. The act of poisoning had a short reign, but its impact was lasting, not because of what it accomplished, but because of what it revealed about power, fear, and the limits of state violence in shaping society. To understand the act of poisoning, you have to understand Henry's mind. By 1531, the king was no longer the athletic, charismatic prince who had ascended the throne 22 years earlier. That man, young, vigorous, confident, had been eroded by power, age, injury, and an obsession with control that bordered on madness. Henry lived in constant fear, not the rational caution of a ruler aware of political threats, but something deeper, something pathological. He saw danger everywhere. Assassins in shadows, poison in food, betrayal in every conversation. His paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Kings throughout history had been murdered, overthrown, poisoned. But Henry's fear metastasized into something that controlled him as much as he controlled England. The jousting accident in 1536, 5 years after the boiling law passed, would make this worse. A horse fell on him, crushing his leg, creating an ulcer that would never heal. For the rest of his life, Henry would live with chronic pain, infection oozing from the wound, the smell of rot emanating from his own body. But even before that injury, his psychology was fractured. He couldn't accept opposition, couldn't tolerate disagreement. Anyone who challenged him, whether on matters of religion, marriage, policy, or simple court etiquette, became an enemy. And enemies had to be eliminated. Not just defeated or dismissed, but destroyed, utterly, publicly, in ways that would terrify anyone else from following their example. This is where the boiling law fits. It wasn't really about Richard Roos or poisoning. It was about Henry asserting absolute authority over life and death, demonstrating that he could create new categories of crime, new methods of execution, new levels of suffering, and Parliament would simply obey. The law itself was an exercise in control. Consider the timing. The poisoning happened in February 1531. By March, Parliament had passed the Act. That's weeks, not months. Impossibly fast by normal legislative standards. It suggests Henry drove the process personally, demanding immediate action, brooking no delay. He wanted the law passed while fear was fresh, while the story of Bishop Fisher's poisoned household dominated conversation, while people were receptive to extreme measures. But why boiling specifically? England had perfectly functional execution methods. Hanging worked. Beheading worked. Even hanging, drawing, and quartering, brutal as it was, had centuries of precedent. Why invent something new? Because Henry needed innovation to maintain power. Traditional punishments had become routine. People had seen hangings their entire lives. They'd witnessed beheadings. The shock value had diminished. To maintain control through fear, Henry needed to escalate. To introduce something so horrific that it would reset people as understanding of what the crown could do to them. Boiling accomplished that perfectly. It was unfamiliar enough to be terrifying, brutal enough to traumatize witnesses, and crucially, it could be presented as proportional to the crime. Poison was secretive, slow, agonizing, so the punishment would be public, slow, agonizing. This gave the law a veneer of justice, of logical consequence, even as it violated every principle of mercy and proportion. Henry's psychology also reveals itself in the details. The law specified, without benefit of clergy, no priest, no confession, no last rites. This wasn't about preventing the condemned from gaming the legal system through clerical privilege. It was about denying them spiritual comfort, about making their suffering total, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Henry wanted the condemned to die believing they were damned, believing there was no salvation, believing their souls were forfeit. This vindictiveness appears throughout Henry's reign. When he executed Anne Boleyn, his second wife, he brought in a special swordsman from France rather than using England's standard axeman. This was presented as mercy. The sword was quicker than the axe, but it was really about control. Henry orchestrated every detail of her death, right down to the choice of blade. He needed to be the author of her suffering, the director of her final moments. The same pattern appears with Thomas Cromwell, Henry as chief minister, and the man who had helped create much of the king's legal framework for absolute power. When Cromwell fell from favour in 1540, Henry didn't just execute him, he had him attainted for treason and heresy, simultaneously contradictory charges that made no legal sense, and sent him to the scaffold on the same day as Walter Hungerford, a convicted sodomite. The message was clear. Even the king's most powerful advisor could be reduced to dying alongside common criminals if he displeased the crown. Henry's paranoia intensified throughout the 1530s and 40s. By the end of his life, he was sleeping surrounded by weapons, eating only food that had been tasted by servants, having staff inspect his bedding for poison residue, trusting virtually no one. This wasn't just caution, this was a man psychologically broken by his own suspicion. The act for poisoning was an externalization of that internal fear. Henry couldn't eliminate the possibility of being poisoned. Poison was invisible, unpredictable, could come from anywhere. But he could make the consequences so terrible that anyone contemplating it would reconsider. The law transformed his personal vulnerability into a weapon. If he had to live in fear, so would everyone else. Modern psychologists analyzing Henry's documented behavior have suggested various diagnoses. Some point to possible traumatic brain injury from jousting accidents causing personality changes. Others note symptoms consistent with paranoid personality disorder, pervasive distrust, hypervigilance, perception of threats where none exist, inability to forgive perceived slights. Still others suggest his leg ulcer caused chronic pain that exacerbated existing psychological issues. But whatever the clinical explanation, the result was the same. Henry became a tyrant driven by fear, and he governed through fear. The Boiling Law was just one example of this pattern. Throughout his reign, he created new treasons, new punishments, new ways to terrorize his subjects into obedience. The act for poisoning reveals Henry's worldview in microcosm. Trust no one. Eliminate threats preemptively. Make examples so brutal that others learn through witnessing rather than experiencing. Control not just behavior, but imagination. Make people unable to even conceive of opposing the crown because the consequences are too horrible to contemplate. This is why the law existed for 15 years despite being used twice. Its value wasn't in application, but in potential. In the constant awareness that it could be used. In the psychological weight it placed on every servant, every cook, every person who handled food in England. They all lived under the shadow of that law, knowing that one accusation could end with them screaming in a cauldron at Smithfield. Henry's psychology, paranoid, controlling, vindictive, shaped England through fear. And when he finally died in 1547, bloated and rotting, his body so corrupted that legend says his coffin leaked, England exhaled. The Boiling Law was repealed within months because it had always been about Henry's personal demons, not England's actual needs. The act for poisoning didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a broader transformation of Tudor England under Henry VIII, systematic reshaping of law, religion, and social order that turned the kingdom into something it had never been before. A centralized state where the crown held absolute power over life, death, and salvation itself. Between 1530 and 1547, Henry fundamentally altered what it meant to be English. He broke from Rome, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. He dissolved the monasteries, seizing their wealth and redistributing it to loyal nobility. He executed 2 of his 6 wives, along with hundreds of religious dissenters, political opponents, and former allies. And he expanded the definition of treason to cover so many offences that virtually any action could be construed as capital crime if the crown desired it. The Boiling Law fits perfectly into this pattern. It was one piece of a larger legal framework designed to eliminate opposition through terror. During Henry's reign, Parliament created multiple new treasons. Denying royal supremacy became treason. Refusing to take the oath of succession became treason. Speaking against the king's marriages became treason. Even imagining the king's death, not planning it, not attempting it, just thinking about it could theoretically be prosecuted as treason. This proliferation of capital offences changed how English society functioned. People became cautious about what they said, even in private conversations. Trust between neighbours eroded. Family members informed on each other to avoid suspicion. The atmosphere resembled what would later be recognized as police state tactics using fear of punishment to control behavior, thought, and expression. The boiling law added a specifically domestic dimension to this control. Most of Henry's new treasons focused on political or religious speech and action, but poisoning addressed the household, the kitchen, the most intimate spaces of daily life. It meant that even in your own home, surrounded by your own servants, you weren't safe, and those servants knew they weren't safe either. One mistake, one false accusation, one moment of bad luck could end with them screaming in a cauldron. This terror had measurable effects on Tudor society. Servant employment patterns changed. Noble households began requiring references, background checks, recommendations from trusted sources before hiring kitchen staff. Some families stopped hiring altogether, relying instead on family members to prepare food. The paranoia extended beyond nobles, wealthy merchants, guild leaders. Anyone with enough money to have enemies began viewing their staff with suspicion. The legal profession transformed as well. Lawyers recognized that Henry's expansion of treason law made virtually everyone vulnerable. The traditional protections of common law trial by jury, rules of evidence, presumption of innocence meant nothing when the Crown could simply issue an act of attainder declaring someone guilty. This undermined the entire judicial system, reducing it to a rubber stamp for royal authority. Some lawyers adapted by becoming more deferential, more willing to find legal justifications for whatever the Crown wanted. Others withdrew from criminal practice altogether, focusing on property law and commercial disputes where royal whim mattered less. Very few risked speaking out about the erosion of legal protections. Most of those who spoke out didn't survive the decade. The Church faced its own crisis. Henry's break from Rome had already shaken religious foundations. But laws like the Act for Poisoning added theological complications. The phrase, without benefit of clergy, meant the condemned couldn't receive sacraments before death. This troubled Catholic and emerging Protestant theologians alike. How could earthly authority override divine mercy? What happened to a soul denied the opportunity for confession and absolution? These questions had no good answers, so they were suppressed. Parish priests learned to avoid discussing the boiling law in sermons. Religious scholars stopped writing about it. The entire theological community developed a kind of collective silence around the issue, acknowledging through absence that something deeply wrong had entered English law. The psychological impact on ordinary people was profound. Tudor England had always been violent. Public executions, corporal punishment, and brutal justice were normal parts of life. But Henry's reign normalized a new level of state violence. Executions became more frequent, more varied in method, more explicitly designed to terrorize rather than simply punish. Children growing up during this period absorbed the lesson that authority was absolute and resistance was fatal. They watched heretics burn at Smithfield. They heard stories about Richard Roos boiling alive. They saw heads mounted on pikes along London Bridge. This created a generational trauma that shaped English culture for decades. The nobility, meanwhile, lived in constant anxiety. No position was safe. No past service guaranteed future security. Thomas Cromwell, the king's most powerful minister, was executed in 1540. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, was beheaded in 1542. Even members of the royal family weren't protected. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was executed in 1541 at age 67 despite her royal lineage. The message was clear. Proximity to power offered no safety. Loyalty earned no protection. The king's favor could evaporate instantly, and when it did, the consequences were swift and brutal. This kept the nobility in line through fear, rather than genuine allegiance. The Act for Poisoning contributed to this atmosphere specifically through its domestic focus. Political treason could be avoided by staying out of politics. Religious treason could be avoided by conforming to whatever doctrine the king currently favored. But poisoning accusations could strike anyone, anywhere, based on nothing more than suspicious circumstance and a hostile accuser. This made it especially terrifying because it was so unpredictable. When Edward VII's Parliament repealed the law in 1547, they did so as part of broader legal reform. The Treason Act of 1547 systematically dismantled much of Henry's framework. It restored the requirement of two witnesses for treason convictions. It eliminated many of Henry's invented treasons. It brought English law back towards something resembling justice rather than pure royal authority. But the damage was done. England had lived through 17 years of Henry's systematic terror. An entire generation had grown up watching the state destroy people through increasingly brutal methods. The boiling laws repeal didn't erase those memories. It didn't undo the trauma. It simply acknowledged that the experiment had failed, that governing through extreme fear was unsustainable. The act for poisoning represented the furthest extreme of Henry's legal innovations. Not the most frequently used, that would be the various religious treasons that killed hundreds. Not the most politically significant, that would be the break from Rome itself. But the most viscerally horrifying. The one that even Tudor England, accustomed to violence, found excessive. Its 15-year existence marked Tudor England's darkest era, when paranoia governed policy, when fear replaced law, when the crown could kill anyone, anywhere, for any reason, using methods designed to maximize suffering and terror. The law's repeal marked the beginning of England's slow return to sanity, though the scars would remain for generations. Bishop John Fisher survived the poisoning in 1531. He wasn't at the dinner table when Richard Roos's contaminated pottage was served. He was fasting that day, a religious discipline that unknowingly saved his life, while 16 of his guests fell violently ill and 2 people died. Fisher must have believed it was divine providence. God had protected him for a reason. That reason, he thought, was to continue his work, to defend the Catholic faith, to stand against King Henry VIII's planned divorce from Catherine of Aragon, to speak truth to power regardless of personal consequences. Fisher had compared himself to John the Baptist, a man willing to die for defending the sanctity of marriage. He meant it. He had no idea how literally that comparison would come to pass. The poisoning attack changed Fisher's life in ways beyond physical danger. It made him a symbol, someone important enough to assassinate, someone whose death would matter politically. And in Henry's England, being important enough to kill often meant you would be killed, just not in the way your enemies originally planned. For 4 years after the poisoning, Fisher continued his opposition to Henry's divorce. He testified at the Legatine trial in 1529, defending Catherine's marriage to Henry as valid and indissoluble. He refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen after Henry married her in 1533. He spoke against the Act of Supremacy, which declared Henry supreme head of the Church of England rather than the Pope. This opposition couldn't last. Henry tolerated it for years because Fisher was too prominent to simply eliminate. He was Bishop of Rochester, a scholarly figure respected throughout Europe, a man whose execution would provoke international outrage. But Henry's patience had limits, and Fisher tested them repeatedly. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Succession, requiring all subjects to swear an oath acknowledging Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn as valid and their children as legitimate heirs to the throne. Fisher refused. He was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London in April 1534, accused of treason for denying the Act of Succession. Fisher spent over a year in the Tower. He was nearly 70 years old, frail, sick, suffering from diseases contracted during his imprisonment. The conditions were harsh cold cells, inadequate food, no medical care. Henry apparently hoped Fisher would simply die in prison, solving the problem without the scandal of execution. But Fisher survived. And then he made a mistake that sealed his fate. In May 1535, Pope Paul III created Fisher a cardinal, naming him Cardinal of Saint-Vital. This was meant to honor Fisher for his defense of the Catholic faith. The Pope hoped it might also protect him. Executing a cardinal would be an unprecedented act, a direct challenge to papal authority. But Henry saw it differently. He viewed the cardinalship as an insult, a foreign power interfering in English affairs, an attempt to elevate a traitor to higher status. Henry's reported response became legendary. When told Fisher had been made a cardinal, the king allegedly said he would send Fisher's head to Rome to receive the cardinal's hat, since Fisher would have no use for it otherwise. On June 17, 1535, Fisher was tried for treason. The charge was denying the royal supremacy, refusing to acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. The trial was brief, the outcome predetermined. Fisher was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the standard punishment for treason. But Henry showed a form of mercy. He commuted the sentence to beheading. This wasn't kindness, it was pragmatism. Hanging, drawing, and quartering would have been too brutal for an elderly bishop. It would have generated more sympathy, more outrage. A clean beheading was still execution, still demonstrated Henry's authority, but allowed for a veneer of respect for Fisher's former position. Fisher was executed on June 22, 1535, at Tower Hill. He was so weak from imprisonment that he could barely walk to the scaffold. Witnesses described him as skeletal, barely able to stand, looking more dead than alive before the executioner's axe fell. He was 76 years old. His body was stripped and left naked on the scaffold for hours as a warning before being buried in an unmarked grave. His head was parboiled, a preservation technique, and displayed on London Bridge for 2 weeks. This was standard treatment for executed traitors. Their heads were mounted on pikes along the bridge as warnings to others. But according to contemporary accounts, Fisher's head appeared to grow more lifelike rather than decaying, his complexion seeming to improve as days passed. This was attributed to divine intervention by Catholics, who began to view Fisher as a martyr. Henry had the head removed and thrown into the Thames, fearing it would become a relic. The man who had nearly died from poison in 1531 was executed by the same king who had created the boiling law supposedly to protect people like him. The irony was brutal and obvious. Henry had used the attack on Fisher as justification for extreme legal measures against poisoning. Then, 4 years later, he executed Fisher himself using those same expanded treason laws. This reveals the true purpose of Henry's legal innovations. They were never really about protecting anyone. They were about eliminating opposition. The boiling law, the expanded definitions of treason, the use of acts of attainder, all of these were tools for destroying anyone who challenged royal authority. Fisher's execution shocked Europe. Pope Paul III was furious. Catholic monarchs condemned Henry as a tyrant. Even some Protestants who disagreed with Fisher theologically found his execution disturbing. Executing an elderly bishop for refusing an oath seemed disproportionate, vindictive, unnecessary. But in England, opposition to the execution had to remain silent. Speaking in Fisher's defense would be treason. Questioning the king's judgment would be treason. Even expressing sympathy for Fisher could be construed as denying the royal supremacy, which was itself treason. Henry had successfully created a system where every form of dissent was criminalized. Fisher was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1935, exactly 400 years after his execution. The Church recognized him as a martyr who died defending religious principles against state tyranny. His feast day is June 22nd, the anniversary of his death. The connection between the poisoning and Fisher's eventual execution reveals the circular logic of Henry's reign. An attack on Fisher justified extreme laws. Those laws established precedents for bypassing traditional legal protections. Those precedents were then used to execute Fisher himself when he became inconvenient. The system Henry created to protect his subjects became the system that destroyed them. Richard Roos died by boiling to protect Bishop Fisher. Bishop Fisher died by beheading at Henry's command. Both deaths served the same purpose, demonstrating royal power and eliminating perceived threats. The actual poisoning, created in response to the attack on Fisher, was just another weapon in Henry's arsenal of terror. And Fisher, who survived poison only through accident, could not survive the king's paranoid rage. The act for poisoning lasted 15 years. It killed 2 people, and yet it remains one of the most notorious laws in English history. Remembered centuries after far more consequential legislation has been forgotten. Why? Because it represents something fundamental about power, fear, and the limits of state violence in civilized society. History books remember Henry VIII for many things. His 6 wives, his break from Rome, his dissolution of the monasteries, his transformation of England from a medieval kingdom into an early modern state. But when historians discuss the brutality of his reign, the boiling law always appears. It's cited as evidence of his paranoia, his cruelty, his willingness to cross boundaries that even other Tudor monarchs respected. The law's legacy begins with how quickly it was repealed. Edward VII's parliament moved against it in 1547, months after Henry's death. In the very first legislative session of the new reign. This wasn't coincidence. The Regency Council had clearly identified the boiling law as a priority for elimination. Among all the harsh legislation Henry had created, this one stood out as uniquely problematic. Too brutal, too excessive, too emblematic of everything wrong with the previous reign. The parliamentary language condemning it as very straight, sore, extreme, and terrible became part of legal history. Future jurists and scholars would cite those words when discussing proportional punishment, state cruelty, and the limits of royal authority. The act for poisoning became a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when fear drives legislation rather than reason. But the law's impact extended beyond England. European legal scholars studied it with a mixture of fascination and horror. In France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, places where boiling was occasionally used, but never formally codified into law, English legal practice became notorious. How could a supposedly civilized nation one of Europe's great powers, sanctioned such barbaric punishment. This damaged England's international reputation during the period when Henry was trying to position himself as a major European monarch. His break from Rome had already alienated Catholic Europe. His execution of Cardinal Fisher and Sir Thomas More in 1535 shocked even Protestant allies. The Boiling Law added another layer of barbarity to Henry's image. It made him seem not strong but unstable, not decisive but cruel. The executions themselves became legendary. Richard Roos's death in 1532 was discussed in taverns and written about in chronicles. Margaret Davy's execution in 1542 added to the growing catalogue of Henry's atrocities. These stories spread through oral tradition, becoming darker and more embellished with each retelling. Some accounts exaggerated the details, others added fictional elements, but the core fact remained undeniable: England had boiled people alive, legally, by royal decree. The law also established a dangerous precedent that legal reformers spent decades dismantling. Henry had successfully reclassified poisoning from felony to treason, bypassing all normal legal protections in the process. If poisoning could be arbitrarily elevated to treason, so could other crimes. This opened the door to abuse any time the Crown wanted someone eliminated. It could simply redefine their alleged crime as treason and proceed to execution without trial. Edward's Parliament recognised this danger and moved to restore traditional legal boundaries. The Treason Act of 1547 not only repealed the Boiling Law but also restored requirements for proper trials, evidence, and witnesses in treason cases. It was a comprehensive attempt to reverse Henry's legal innovations and return England to rule of law rather than rule by royal whim. But some damage couldn't be undone. The psychological scars remained. People who had witnessed the executions carried those memories for life. Children who grew up hearing the stories absorbed them as cautionary tales about state power. The Boiling Law shaped how an entire generation understood the relationship between subjects and crown, that ultimately the king could do anything to anyone, and Parliament would simply comply. This legacy influenced English political thought for centuries. When philosophers and legal scholars discussed tyranny, state violence, and the limits of royal authority, they often cited Henry VIII's reign as example. And within that reign, the Boiling Law served as shorthand for cruelty beyond justification. Writers like Edward Coke, the great jurist of the Jacobean era, explicitly referenced the act of poisoning as a law too severe to live long, acknowledging that even Tudor England had limits on acceptable punishment. The law also became fodder for Protestant propaganda against Catholic monarchs. After England's religious settlement under Elizabeth I, Protestant writers used Henry's brutality, including the Boiling Law, to argue that Catholicism bred tyranny and cruelty. The irony was rich, considering Henry created the law while still essentially Catholic, before England's Protestant turn. But propaganda rarely concerns itself with such nuances. In later centuries, as England developed more humane legal systems and abolished capital punishment for most crimes, the Boiling Law was referenced as evidence of progress. Victorian historians wrote about it with horror, using it to demonstrate how far English civilization had advanced. They positioned Tudor brutality as a dark age from which England had emerged into enlightened modernity. Modern historians take a more nuanced view. They recognize that Tudor justice was brutal by contemporary standards, but was considered normal for its time. The Boiling Law stands out not because Tudor England was uniquely cruel. Many European nations used equally horrific punishments, but because it was so clearly driven by one man's paranoia rather than any genuine legal need. The law has also entered popular culture. Historical novels about Henry VIII often include the boiling executions as dramatic set pieces. Television series and films depicting the Tudor period sometimes reference or show the cauldron at Smithfield. The image of someone being boiled alive has become synonymous with Henry's reign, along with beheadings and the Tower of London. Legal scholars still study the act for poisoning in courses on legal history and the evolution of criminal law. It appears in textbooks as an example of how not to create legislation, how personal fear and political convenience can corrupt legal systems, how extreme punishment can undermine rather than strengthen state authority, how laws designed to terrify can ultimately backfire by making the state look tyrannical rather than just. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the act of poisoning is what it reveals about the nature of terror as a governing tool. Henry believed that extreme punishment would prevent crime through fear, but the boiling executions show that there is a threshold beyond which punishment stops being deterrent and becomes simply atrocity. When witnesses faint and vomit, When people turn away in horror, when the execution becomes more disturbing than the crime it punishes at that point, the state has lost moral authority rather than gained it. The law existed for 15 years. 2 people died. And 5 centuries later, we still remember it as one of the darkest moments in English legal history. That's the true legacy of the act for poisoning, not what it accomplished, but what it revealed about power, fear, and the fragility of justice when tyranny masquerades as law.